Hello, I'm Rebecca Self. I'm the Managing Director and co-founder of Seawolf Sustainability Consulting. I'm here at the Online Prosperity Show, and I'll be talking about finance and sustainability.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another exciting episode of the Online Prosperity Show. I'm your host, Prosper Taruvinga, and today I am giving you somebody who's not only navigated the high stakes of the world of finance, but he's also making waves in sustainability. Now, Rebecca, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, thank you for asking, and I hope you too.
Fantastic. Well, you're probably the first person who's actually asked me how I'm doing. Everybody else just comes in and looks just after their own self. So hopefully this is going to be a fantastic, show today. And for those that are meeting Rebecca for the very first time, Rebecca is the co-founder and managing director of Seawolf Sustainability Consulting, a firm that's helping organizations around the world integrate sustainable finance practices. Now, it's no longer like in the olden days where it's cutthroat. She is actually spearheading some interesting changes in the finance sector there. Now, she's got a career that spans over 2 decades, including roles like first ever CFO of sustainable finance at HSBC. So Rebecca's journey is nothing short of inspiring. I want you to imagine moving from the bustling financial hubs of London and Zurich to actually going out and shaping global best practices in sustainable finance. That is pioneering in its own right. Oh, and there's also a fun fact. Rebecca told me that she has a tattoo that shows the parts per million of carbon dioxide in her birth date, and it's something that obviously she is passionate about. In the year you were born, it was 337, was it?
That's exactly right, yes. I won't give you the dates, but yes, and just to give a sense of a benchmark, today, the same reading, if you look at the same place, is around 425 parts per million. So that's for a million parts, that's the number of parts which are carbon dioxide. So it's increased quite rapidly during my lifetime.
Wow, that's a lot of breathing, because apparently we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide, right? So people have been breathing 89 parts more ever since you were born, but we'll figure out all that. We are not here to be carbon dating or anything of that nature. I just wanted to throw that in, so that people will think I'm a little bit smart, but that's why we bring in experts like yourself to let us know what that is all about. All right. So this now becomes a constant reminder of why Rebecca does what she does. I mean, if you're going to have that tattooed on your person, then that means you're really passionate about something. So we're going to be diving into Rebecca's story, her transition from traditional finance to sustainability, and how her expertise is now helping businesses turn sustainable practices into real value. And if you're wondering why you should consider listening to this or watching Rebecca, and obviously maybe consulting with her at Seawolf, well, I'll just say stay tuned, because she's going to teach you how to save the planet and actually turn a profit. So let's jump right in. Rebecca, I'm going on and on talking about things I know nothing about. You've had the incredible journey. You've had the 2 decades, of moving from traditional finance to now becoming a leading voice in sustainable finance. First of all, what does that all mean?
It's a good question. And maybe starting with sustainable finance. So many people will know what traditional finance is, and that's usually lending and investing money and expecting some sort of financial return over a particular period. And often, with most types of traditional finance, is really looking at those financial returns. So I'm an accountant, and that means looking at your balance sheet, your income statement, what the profits are, looking at your time period, the amount of the investment, all those traditional accounting style metrics. Now, with sustainable finance, it's about still looking at those things. Of course, they're important, but also adding in additional metrics such as carbon emissions, which we mentioned earlier, conservation type metrics, so looking at the impact on nature, the impact on conservation of an investment, looking at social metrics as well, things like human rights and so on. So adding in those additional metrics and including them in investment decisions. So moving beyond solely traditional finance to incorporate some of these other perspectives into financial decision making.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for clarifying that. And it really sets the tone of what we're going to be talking about. But Rebecca, I've got two girls. One is 9 and one is 5. You know, the last time I asked them what they wanted to be when they grow up, the other one wanted to be a witch. How did you get into finance?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a funny answer from your girl. But for me, so my journey, I grew up close to London in the UK, just 20 miles north of London. Both my parents worked in the public sector, so for London Underground, and in social and healthcare. And at quite a relatively young age, I decided that I wanted to do something completely different from my family and work in the world of finance. And that was somewhat inspired by various trips when I was young and at school to different financial exchanges. We went to go and visit the City of London. I remember there was a live exchange at that time, so trading in person with all the coloured jackets. And this was just so exciting for me at the time. And also, the place where I ended up working with my first full-time job was just being built. And that was Canary Wharf in London, which is a huge number of glass skyscrapers. And that was pretty much a wasteland while I was growing up. And I remember visiting and being told, no, this place is going to be full of all these huge buildings and regenerated. And I thought, wow, that's really the place I want to work. So long story short, I studied economics at university, at the University of Southampton on the south coast, the sea in the UK. And from there, I moved into banking. My very first job in banking was at one of those banks, one of those big glass buildings in Canary Wharf in London. I had about 10 years, which were very traditional sort of banking type roles in the finance departments, risk departments of a number of different international banks. And it was a good experience. And yeah, it really gave me, I think, that grounding and perspective around finance and those very traditional sort of financial views. And this was all before the financial crisis. So a high growth environment, very exciting, very dynamic. And as I said, a good grounding. But things started to change after that.
I can imagine, because obviously the world that was invested for in that particular time no longer existed, and obviously that's why there was that turn of events. You did mention mom was in sustainability. Is that or social?
Yeah, like healthcare, health and social care.
Fantastic. Is that where this side of things would have emanated from, or did you then have other role models while you were growing up?
Looking back, I think so. I think maybe that was one thing that sort of shaped a bit my perspective in the world. But also as a sort of younger person, I think I was probably about 7 or 8 years old when I remember being really interested around conservation and specifically elephants. Actually, I loved elephants, and I entered a competition. It was an art competition at that time, and I was quite upset about the ivory trade, some of the sort of issues around that, and so I think that was something that also shaped me looking back. So I think parents and having those jobs outside of finance is one piece, being more aware socially. I think being very interested in nature at a young age is another piece. And again, looking back, another thing that I somehow think, oh yeah, maybe that was some of the seeds, to excuse the pun, but on one side of my family, there were also florist shops and nurseries. And I also think now living in the Netherlands, I look back at some of that horticulture, being aware of things growing, plants, flowers, and think about the seasons and some of those perspectives around nature and being quite attuned to nature and seasons and horticulture. I think maybe that was part of what shaped my view now as well around sustainability.
Absolutely, because you were going into a place where it was going to be nice, new buildings, glass, and just across the road from you was nature, flowers, and maybe there's a bit of you that just wants to go back to that part of you that was just looking at those flowers, and maybe that could be something that is now drawing you into this work you're doing now.
I think so. Yeah, I do wonder about that. And another piece, today I live very close to the sea, to the North Sea. And as a young child, I remember visiting the sea very often in the UK. So it was very grey, quite miserable, quite rainy, wasn't particularly glamorous. But also, we lived quite close to a canal and close to rivers. And I think, again, being close to nature, close to the sea, now when I look back, I think, oh, maybe there was something there that sort of is coming back to some of those childhood memories.
Absolutely. Did you ever take a trip to go see the elephants?
I have seen them. That was in later life. Yeah, so I was really lucky to go to South Africa. It was actually for a friend's wedding in my 30s, and it was incredible. Actually, most incredible experience. They're really amazing creatures, absolutely enormous, which was quite overwhelming. But yeah, it was an incredible experience.
Was that experience as how you had imagined it? Because I, being from South Africa, we grew up around elephants, and we call them
Mm.
gentle giants because they just walking, eating. One meal for them could devastate a whole forest or a whole farm, but we just enjoyed just their poise and nature and things of that nature. So yeah, was it how you imagined it? Because you loved them when you were a kid.
Yeah, I think it was. It's a good question. I think it was how I imagined it. They were definitely even bigger than I imagined. I think one thing that struck me that was probably very different was just the landscape. So when you actually look out in some of the places at this incredible savannas or just this very vast open landscape, it was probably a lot more green than I anticipated and a lot more vast than I anticipated. So that I don't think I'd quite pictured in my mind exactly how the external environment would look. And the creatures themselves, absolutely incredible, but just huge. That was my overwhelming impression.
Fantastic. Now, obviously, you've come across the biggest, animals on land, and you're living close to the sea. Even though in Sanford, the sea is only open for 6 months, right? From my memory, they don't open it the whole year because of just how it is, right? Is that a correct, my assumption?
Well, it's open all year round. So I go in the sea all year round, but I would say generally for about 4 or 5 months of the year, it's somewhat warm enough to swim. So it probably depends a little bit how good you are with cold water. For me, I go in all year round. But to give an idea, in March is normally the coldest month for sea temperatures, and the sea is around 3 degrees Celsius. So it's very chilly. Sometimes as I walk down to the beach, I have to break the ice on the beach before I go in the sea to do a cold water swim very briefly at that time of year. But then if fast forward to around September, the sea would be more like 18 degrees. So it really changes depending on the time of year. And at the moment, the sea has been very, very warm, so unexpectedly warm. And so it goes back to our earlier conversation around carbon emissions and sustainability. But the sea temperatures are warming, but still pretty cold in the winter months.
Absolutely. No, what I'm just trying to put across here is we live around an environment that equally is surviving without, our input. And we should actually try as much as possible to maintain that. And, if we can do that in our day-to-day lives, like, the work that you're now embarking on, if somebody's work or business is going to impact the elephants or the warming of the sea, that would take away the expression and the happiness that I just saw on your face while we recalled these stories. Now, would it be the reason why you're not working in sustainable finance?
It's not directly. So I actually started working before moving to this part of the world. So I think sort of continuing the story, one of the main motivations actually for pivoting my career and moving into this area was the financial crisis. So prior to that, I think I mentioned when I was growing up and being relatively sort of attuned with nature, interested in nature, really loving animals and creatures. And then I think as I hit my teenage years, and then certainly in my 20s, working in the world of finance and working in these big glass towers, I became a bit disconnected from that, in all honesty. So it felt very remote. And I was sort of spending a lot of time on computers, in offices. Again, I'm grateful for that time, but on financial models, working in those sort of traditional finance roles. And then I said I'm grateful for that time. It was a good experience and very dynamic. But then the financial crisis happened. And for me, that was a really big turning point. It was around 10 years into my career. And I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, what on earth is this industry that I'm part of and the roles that I'm part of? What's it doing? And how's it contributing to the world in a positive way or not? And what's my role in this? What am I actually contributing to the world as part of this role? And so I just really started to ask myself a lot of questions, and that was internal questions around my own impact, my own role, more widely for the financial industry, its role in the economy, its role in society. And I just really struggled to understand how things had got so badly wrong, frankly, because with the financial crisis, there's a huge sort of global meltdown, impacts on economic growth, GDP, and moving beyond the numbers, the bit that really impacted me, I was spending time in the US, and it was somewhere close to Chicago. And I was working at that time on mortgages that met people who had had their homes foreclosed upon. And some of those conversations with people who had been really severely negatively impacted by very expensive mortgages that they'd chosen to take out and that had been offered by the banks at that time. That really impacted me because all of a sudden these as I describe it, the numbers on a spreadsheet or the numbers in a financial model had faces and had names and had stories. And so that became a moment of real soul searching, actually. And I think that was one of the moments where I decided to pivot my career into a different direction.
Absolutely. When you started this answer, you did mention a disconnect that would have occurred at the time where you're working within the concrete jungle, so to speak, or the glass jungle, so to speak, and you felt disconnected with maybe nature and things like that. Was it just a Rebecca experience, or does this happen to a lot of people?
My sense is it happens to a lot of people. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with those people. It's just part of a function of the environment, of the culture, often of that industry. For me in particular, when I looked at some of the, let's say, portfolios of those mortgages, it was just numbers. As I said, it didn't have faces or names. When I looked at, let's say, different transactions the bank was involved in, I didn't think about the real world impact of the people who were in those companies or the impacts of nature, positive or negative, that those companies, the banks lended and invested to. So I think that disconnect, in my experience, is quite common. And it's part of perhaps a little bit part of the culture of finance, certainly at that time, and is to really look at things in a very pure financial way and solely looking at financial numbers and not perhaps considering those wider societal impacts, whether they're positive or negative. And actually, since I decided to sort of pivot my own career, and since I'm decided to set up my own company, quite a number of people who I've worked with over the years, or even more broadly in the financial institutions, have reached out to me and have talked about their own experiences. And they also have experienced some of this disconnect and looking for something more broad. So I think it's not just me. I think it's something more broad for the industry too.
Absolutely. And I would think this presents a very big challenge when you show up and you want to tell people, hey, there could be elephants involved in this investment that you guys want to do, or the sea levels are quite rising based on us doing X, Y, and Z. What's the feel like in the boardrooms when you rock up and you're talking elephants and sea levels?
It's been quite a mix. I think back when I sort of first started to move into this career, and looking at the time, that was about 14 years ago, and it was an incremental pivot of my career, and then moving a bit more quickly in the last sort of 5 years. But when I first started moving into this area, working in this area, and it became a part of my role, I would hear things from people that I worked with, or more broadly in the industry, along the lines of, you're a tree hugger, this is a career limiting move, no one cares in finance about this topic, this isn't part of what the role is, this is something really that no one's interested in this industry. So there was quite a lot of strong reactions. And actually, they're the negative reactions. And I heard that a lot more sort of when I initially started moving. Conversely, I also heard a lot of people who were really interested and really wanted to learn a lot more about the role. So there's a bit of a mix. But back 14 years ago, definitely did have a bit of name calling. Definitely did have that feeling that I was a little bit the odd one, sometimes in the meeting rooms and sometimes in different environments, in financial environments. And it started to change. So it did change. And I think there were more open conversations about some of those topics, people being interested around some of those topics, different trainings, because it is emerging, it's quite new. So things did start to change. I would say, sadly, I do wonder about now whether things are slightly reversing. So I hear a little bit more of some of those names again, but maybe that's also just part of the evolution of this whole topic of sustainable finance. So I sort of try to be a little bit philosophical about that and not take it at all personally. I don't think it is a personal thing. I think people just sometimes have a very strong reaction to this topic, and often it's not about me in particular, but it might be about something going on with them. So leave them to it.
Absolutely. And congratulations. With all of that, you actually ended up becoming the first ever CFO of Sustainable Finance at HSBC. Was your office in the car park?
No, it was not. No, it was I was in one of those big glass towers that I mentioned, and somewhere near the top, actually, level 39. So yeah, pretty high up in the building.
They didn't put you in the communal area, just so you have your desk.
Yeah, no, not in the car park. No.
Fantastic. I mean, obviously, it's quite remarkable what you've actually achieved. Now, with what you're saying, and you're saying moving up until this day and age, your work sort of now spans across different regions, different sectors. What sort of key differences in response, or how various industries or regions actually approach sustainability? Because as you've mentioned, that's been somewhat of a steep curve for a lot of people to adopt, but now you're crossing and chopping and changing between industries. Are some industries readily accepting, or some industries, just still holding on to saying you're a tree hugger?
Well, and this is all a lot of generalizations. So there's a big spectrum of activities within industries, within geographies, but just based on my experience, and as I said, it is general comments, so I don't want to stereotype, but in general, so some of the evolutions that I've seen during that time, I think initially with sustainability, it was very, very much focused on measuring carbon emissions, looking at climate change in particular, and understanding the positive and negative impacts of climate change. So that's some of the physical risks, such as floods, more extreme weather events, and so on, and understanding the impact that would have on finance. And I've seen the sustainability topic in finance widen and broaden. So, for example, now I still look at that piece, but I also will look at, we mentioned oceans, ocean conservation, blue carbon. I'll look at nature, so how financial decisions can impact nature, and that being seascapes, but it could also be the land, it could be agriculture, it could be about different species. Water is another topic, so water usage, water wastage, and linking to that, the circular economy. So how to recycle more, have closed loop processes. So I've seen the topic of sustainability itself in a finance context broaden, and that's very welcome. Still a lot more to do on all those topics, but definitely is broadened. I think the other piece I've seen is initially, I would say there was a lot of focus on this topic in Europe. I'm based here in the Netherlands, and in particular, and again, generalizations in the Netherlands, in the Nordics, France, other areas of Northern Europe. Quite a lot of activity on this topic back in those days, and I've seen that broaden and widen. So there is more interest now from Asia, the US, Canada, but of course it's a mix, and Australia. So there's a mix of activity depending on where you are, but I would still probably characterize Europe as a little bit further ahead on this topic, in particular around new regulations. And then also with financial institutions themselves, I think initially when this was very new, there was quite a steep learning curve, as you mentioned. So lots of training, increasing awareness, those larger financial institutions starting to measure, starting to understand some of their footprints with sustainability, their lending and investing. And we did see a few years ago quite a number of large financial institutions make commitments about being net zero carbon emissions in the future. What we've started to see is, I think, some challenges around achieving those commitments. And for example, very recently in the last couple of weeks, some very large banks were referencing the need for policy and for policymakers. So voluntary action from those large financial institutions not being enough, and the need for collaboration with policymakers, as well as our own individual actions as well. So I've seen the topic evolve in that way, and the need to move beyond voluntary action for companies to also incorporate policy.
Because from what you're saying, because if people are actually doing end-to-end and obviously closing the loop with whatever sustainability acts they're doing, they actually stand to maybe save a bit of money. I've actually gotten my family to reuse the tea bags that they use in the house, just so that, we can save money on, the grocery bill there. So I'm only also supposing that if that is implemented within a larger organization, if they are obviously implementing some of those things, it becomes a competitive advantage. But I am hearing that if policy is now going to be implemented, some people are still just looking at this as a nice to have rather than a necessity then.
I think that's right. Yes. And as I said, it is a mix, but yeah, there are some organisations where it is seen as that nice to have, that voluntary effort. And so there's a need to have a level playing field in that respect, and to also have some of those policies and regulations, particularly where there are sort of very large, significant issues that need to be tackled.
Absolutely. And how are you advising people? I mean, obviously, you could then maybe tell us more about the unique services that Seawolf Sustainability Consulting is offering, and how you're actually advising clients to, obviously based on the needs that they have for their work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also perhaps sort of going back to this topic of sustainable finance. So it's about firstly integrating some of these additional metrics, so social metrics or environmental metrics, or taking those into account when making those lending and investing decisions. And that's by financial institutions themselves. It's also completed by accountants and finance teams who are in any company in the economy, so they can start to incorporate some of these new types of metrics. So the type of advice and the type of work that I do is often around what those new types of metrics are, or what the new regulations are, or the new policies are, and how companies can prepare for the must do, because there are things that are coming which they must do for compliance. So that's one piece, is starting with that compliance, those regulations and those metrics and numbers. But the other piece that I think is really vital in this area is exactly what you mentioned. It's looking at the business opportunities, because there are business opportunities in this space. There are shifts in thinking and mindset around business and around the ways things can be done. So it's moving beyond solely the compliance to look at some of these other things. So to just give a couple of examples, one could be, for instance, on the circular economy. So circular economy being more reuse, reducing waste, moving to different type of business practices. Now, in the short run, moving to some of those business practices could be more expensive. So if you look very solely, purely at financial metrics, using sort of reusing materials might be more expensive than using completely brand new virgin materials. But in the long run, if you look at other types of metrics, such as customer demand, customers may prefer to have these products. If you look at the end of life, where there could be a penalty if you've used some of those virgin materials, so you save money at the end of life of some of those products, then you start to have a different type of business decision. So there's an opportunity if you start to look less short term and at a more longer term perspective. So I help businesses think about those metrics, think about those opportunities, and they'll know their business far better than I will, but just help to work with them to identify some of those linkages between finance and sustainability, and looking at how some of those different decisions could be made, what sort of changes they could think about making to help incentivize some of those longer term decisions and shifts that support sustainability in the longer term. And maybe just to give a sort of very tangible example. So there's a project I'm currently working on, which is real estate. So that's looking at buildings, and actually going back to office buildings at the moment. So there's a large number of buildings, obviously all around the world. They're often made from steel, concrete, glass, very carbon intensive materials. And they have often not as long a lifetime as you might expect. So the lifetime could be 25 or 30 years. And after that time, it could be that they're simply knocked down and built again. That's very intensive, that carbon intensive, and that consumes a lot of materials and a lot of resources. So in this particular example, working with a whole range of different companies, but to look at what sort of metrics can be incorporated into financial decision making now to help incentivize building materials out of timber or materials which are more sustainable, more resilient, also to some of those negative climate impacts, and potentially last longer. So they don't need to have that end of life, or they could be reused more easily or retrofitted at that end of life for the building. So I won't get too much into it, but that just gives you a bit of a feeling. It's working through some of those topics with different companies, thinking about those different ways decisions can be made, different metrics, and looking at the longer term for those businesses and products. And ultimately, the idea is to get to more opportunities as well, business opportunities.
Absolutely, I can totally see that. And you did mention a real estate business that you're sort of helping. What sort of people need to show up at Seawolf that you want to work with?
Yeah, so there's a whole range of different organisations that we work with. I often describe it as working with the willing. So, my job isn't to convince someone that climate change is real. But I enjoy working with people who are willing and who are open to making changes and adapting to changes. And I'll often work with the finance teams. So that's the accountants, the risk teams, and the finance teams who are in companies across all different sectors. And then I'll also work with the sustainability teams, because many companies, depending on their size, they may have a sustainability team and a finance team. And so I work with bringing those two teams together. I can hopefully try and sort of speak both the languages, because they often have quite different technical terms that they use, different types of metrics that they use. So I can help facilitate training, workshops, different ideas and reporting where those two teams get brought together and work together. And it's really all different industries in all different places around the world. But really that working with the willing and working with those finance and sustainability teams.
Absolutely. I'll make sure that all those your links will be in the show notes so that people can maybe take a look at your website and see if they will be a perfect fit to consult with you and things like that. Now, when we started the show,
Thank you.
That's all right, Rebecca. When we started the show, you introduced us to a young girl that was eager to get started in the workforce and get involved in the whole banking scenario and things of that nature. But so much has changed in all this time. I mean, you've been in the business for about 20 years now, and I know so much has changed, and you've clearly navigated this financial sector in ways that are unprecedented. I mean, you were one of the first, sustainability CFOs in a very notable bank, and there was no precedent to that. What's one piece of advice that maybe you'd give to financial, professionals that are also looking to pivot into a more sustainable finance, career path?
Then it's a really good question. I think, I mentioned that disconnect earlier. I think one thing with finance is it is easy to get a bit disconnected from the outside, and sometimes financial institutions are sort of in their own little bubble or even their own little location in a city or in a place. So I think one piece of advice is to just be a bit open and think more broadly beyond perhaps your particular role or particular sector. Put your hands up for different opportunities. and to really just sort of get out there and talk to different people about this topic. And for me, what that looked like in practice was number one, getting some education. So in my spare time, I did a short course. That was with an organisation called CISL. That's the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership. So I did a short course with them. And that was part time in my own spare time. And I then decided to do a master's, and again part time at the same time as a job in this topic. So I think one piece is around education. I think the other piece, and just perhaps linking back to that, you don't know what you don't know. And so there were many things that I learned. I just had to be a bit open to different ways of thinking. And that can be a bit counterintuitive. I found it a bit counterintuitive to finance, because often with finance, you want this nice linear answer. It's problem, here's the answer. And actually being open to the fact that you might not have all the answers, or there are these different things that you've not thought about. That's a bit of a mindset shift. So I think education is one. I think the second piece that also links to being open-minded and sort of thinking in perhaps different ways is really to try and sort of get out there and as I mentioned, talk to different people. So again, to give some examples of what that meant for me in practice, I did a little bit of volunteering. I also did some runs. So I took up running at some point and decided to get sponsored. And I did some sponsorship with a local charity that was in London. And that charity supported sort of young kids and getting them out into nature, doing gardening, going back to gardening and all of those things. So that was a great opportunity for me to meet people in East London, local to where I live, who were gardeners, who were nothing to do with finance, who I would never normally speak to, and also just feel that I was, maybe contributing in a small way, as well as learning. I got a huge amount out of that too. And even just recently here in the Netherlands, I sort of continue to try and do that. So, for example, participate in there's beach cleaning, so picking up plastic litter from the beach locally to where I live. There was an organisation called SUP Mission, who I met recently, so SUP Mission, who have paddle boards, who are on a local canal and river to where I live, and again collecting plastic from the river. There's also someone called Paul Way, and that's WAYE, and he lives locally, and he is a plogger, and that's PLOGG. So runs and picks up litter along the way, and he had an initiative for the Formula One Grand Prix, which is about 1 kilometre from where I live. So I think education, but also just talking to different people and reaching out, and particularly locally in the community, there's always just a huge amount going on. I'm blown away by some of the people I meet, and I'm so inspired by them too.
Absolutely. I quite like that open-mindedness, because didn't we just end up talking about elephants and flowers, and somebody would have been thinking, wait a minute, is this all about sustainability, finance, or things of that nature? But obviously, having been around all that, now what it's like, the traditional side, and what the future sort of might be spelling out for those that are watching. What sort of trends or development do you think will actually start shaping the future of sustainable finance that people can actually be anticipating and looking out for?
Yeah, well, I mentioned some of the policy side earlier. So I do think there'll be more regulations, more policy coming up in this area, and it will move at different speeds around the world. There's one in particular I'll just mention for accountants, which is ISSB. So there are new accounting standards that will start in this area. So it's incorporating some of these new metrics into formal international accounting standards. So I think that's one piece, more regulation and compliance. I think the other piece is around probably shifts in sort of demographics. I think there'll be naturally more demand for this area, more interest in this area. And probably that's just due to sort of changes in interest and as sort of younger people increasingly get involved in the workforce. So I think that's something probably to anticipate, and there'll be changes of all different sorts as that happens. But I do think there's also something else with sustainability where the external events that we see will become ever more extreme. And so, it's not at all something I welcome, but, sadly, there will be more extreme weather events that we see right now. There's a number of hurricanes and other severe weather events in the Atlantic. And we will see more of that as a result of these sort of negative sustainability impacts and more carbon emissions. So I think there will be more extreme weather events. There will be just a more difficult environment that humans are living in, for all sorts of reasons. I think another piece there is about more extreme weather events and sustainability, but also as a society, we can see that there's an increasing inequality, so an increasing concentration of wealth with a fewer number of people. And again, that's also a sustainability issue, because that means for some businesses, there'll be less people, frankly, that they can sell products to. So there will be impacts on economic growth potentially in the future as a result of that concentration of wealth. So I think a more challenging environment for businesses and people to operate and to live in, sadly. But I think one of the consequences of that will be, people will become more aware of this topic and more action will be required. So I think there's sort of a few different things going on. I think inevitably probably more policy, more compliance, more accounting standards. There'll be some of those more negative impacts that I mentioned, both societal and at an environmental level. But then as a consequence, probably even more awareness, probably particularly from younger people, I could imagine, but not exclusively. And I think much more demand and also opportunities that come out of that too. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Absolutely. Don't you worry. There will be a way. I've seen the floods that are happening in America right now. I mean, you only just need to look outside your window to see that, hey, action needs to be taken. So there's not going to be a disconnect anymore, Rebecca. Don't you worry. It's all going to come to some sort of a reckoning. But for those people that are probably a little bit too far away from Sanford, away from the North Sea, but they're watching and they really want to incorporate, this sustainability into maybe their business strategy. What is a simple step that they can maybe take to get started today?
Yeah, and again, it's a great question. So for different business owners, I think it's about really thinking about your own product and your own service, and also where you're based. So that's always a good place to start. Think about what you're doing. Get your house in order. I think sort of before looking at some of those wider things. So I always think looking at your immediate location or the locations where your products and services are a good start. And for example, you could look at a hotspot analysis. So are the particular locations which are more severely impacted or not, and have a sort of prioritization. Maybe focus on some of those areas where there's more negative impacts, which are identified using a prioritization. So that could be, where there's flood risk, for example. It could also be where perhaps there's more immediate nature or more biodiversity, and looking at how to help encourage some of that. So I think location is one piece. I think from a product perspective, it's looking at, if you have a particular product, what type of materials are used for that product? Are there alternatives that could be used, which perhaps over the longer term have different types of impacts? What does that really mean for your business today or in the longer term? So it's thinking quite strategically and asking just some different types of questions for your business around, in the long term, how might sustainability impact me? What types of materials does my product use today? What changes might I expect in the future? What things could I do to shift some of that product today? I think for service providers, again, it's also thinking about sort of those services that you offer. How do they contribute to sustainability or not? Are the changes that could be made in the longer term more strategically so they fit more sustainably? For many of us, we work remotely or we spend time in offices. So it's then thinking about data centers, how we get our electricity, the move to clean energy, what type of transport we use. So all of those different features of sort of day-to-day life and how we can make sometimes quite small changes, but they might have quite a big impact.
You see, while you were talking, the fan of my laptop just kicked in, and maybe that was a sign, Rebecca, that I think it's we need to actually start becoming sustainable here. I can't thank you enough for the time that you spent with me on the call today. I mean, your life story and your experience and everything else that you're doing, your insights and expertise all just shown in the little amount that we spent together today. So thank you for going through this journey.
Oh, thank you. And well, likewise, really, thank you. And I think it's also about talking about these topics. And I think for me, it's not a purity test. There's plenty of things I do that aren't that sustainable. I mentioned the Formula One earlier. I'm really interested in Formula One. I love Formula One. Big Lewis Hamilton fan. So it's not about being pure. It's not about having all of the answers, but that mindset, being quite open-minded from a business perspective, just asking those questions and thinking about change. And there are different ways to do things. And I think also being connected with that local environment and nature, I think that's just really important. And it's from a business perspective, but also just a very human perspective too. I think it links back to well-being and all those other sorts of things too, and just taking care of our immediate surroundings and the people around us too.
Absolutely. I just had a flash of an elephant eating flowers, and I was just like, oh, that. But it's quite clear that your journey from obviously traditional finance to the forefront of sustainable finance is not just inspiring, but it's an actual roadmap for so many people that are looking to make an impact. I mean, yes, like you said, we're not all perfect, but at least if we're doing our bit to make this world a happier place, there would be so much more left for not only us, but for future generations. For on behalf of everybody else who's going to be enjoying an apple tomorrow morning because of the efforts that you've done today, thank you. It's people like yourself that are really, playing their part, whereas other people are still thinking it's a nice to have. So I can't wait to see what you're going to be doing with all of this. Fantastic. Now, to our viewers, if you found value in this conversation, and I'm sure you did, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this episode with anyone who's passionate about the intersection of finance and sustainability, or somebody who just really cares about where the future is headed. And for those that, like taking notes, I'm hoping you took so many notes. If you didn't, rewatch this episode for all the golden nuggets of wisdom. And I want you to stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to bring you the best minds in the business. Until next time, let us all keep building a profitable and enjoyable business that's good for both people and the planet. Bye for now.